Okay, let's talk Curse of the Mistwraith. Curse of the Mistwraith by Janny Wurts, published in 93, and is the first book in the 11-book Wars of Light and Shadow, I guess. The Wars of Light and Shadow is finishing this year. So if you are interested in this series, this is a great time to start reading, although you'll have to read quickly because the final book is out in May and all 11 books are door stoppers. So I have found it really difficult to bring together my thoughts on this book. And when that happens, I do something which I wouldn't ever do for really anything else, but I look at other reviews. And I saw today a review by fantasy author Mark Lawrence for Curse of the Mistwraith. And in his review, he says, in fact, he uses a great analogy. He says he doesn't like jazz music. And he says that no matter, he can enjoy a jazz performance, he can, watch a friend play jazz or whatever, but he doesn't sit at home and by choice choose to listen to jazz. So one of the interesting things is I think that I have a very similar opinion to Mark Lawrence. I like jazz, but I don't think I like this book. Now, this book is really, really well written. The prose is fantastic, but the prose is of a kind of dense and very ornamental style that I don't really vibe with. Let's see if we can get an interesting. So, here we go. The next spasm broke through his control. Deaf to his brother's laughter, Arathon buried his face in his hands. The seizure left him bloody to the wrists, yet he summoned breath and spoke again. Restrain yourself and listen. According to the Rovens records, the ancestors who founded our royal lines came to Dashin-Allur through the World's End Gate. If you don't read fantasy, you might think that's what all fantasy is like. But the floweriness of the prose, the denseness of the prose, I didn't really get on with. And I think that overall that was what hampered my enjoyment of the book. It took me quite a long time to read, like almost a week, which is, in fact, I think over a week in general, which is a lot longer than it would normally take me to read a fantasy novel, even one that is 700 pages long, 800 pages long in this case. There's a lot to like in this book. So I've already told you that I didn't love it, and that I might even say I didn't like it. I did finish it. Normally my rule is that if I think a book is kind of wasting my time or that is not that I'm not enjoying, I will stop reading. I think that this book also has the cardinal sin of extremely, extremely long chapters. So I swapped from reading the physical edition because of the dense prose and the small print in this edition. I was actually really struggling to read this. I was getting like 20 or 30 pages in an hour, maybe even less. I think the first night I started reading this, I read for almost 2 hours and only got about 35 pages in. And that's very unusual. For me, for example, the Brandon Sanderson book, Tress of the Emerald Sea, which is a very open and accessible prose style, I will admit is a lot more accessible. I guess again, I managed to get through like half of that 300 odd page book in a night. In 2 or 3 hours, I can often read over 100 pages. Whereas for Curse of the Mistwraith, I was struggling to get through like 30 in an hour, 20 or 30. And it's one of those things where I think this book is probably, and I mean, having a look at the reviews, this is quite a polarizing book. Most people on Goodreads are either rating it 5 stars or 2 stars, and it's very interesting because nobody seems to be giving it one star. No reasonable reviewer seems to be giving it 1 star, and I think that the reason why that is because we can all tell it's a good book. This book isn't bad. You know, like the storytelling is good, the structure is good, the characters are interesting, the world building is good. But I think the style in which the book is told, which isn't limited to the prose, but is also specifically the style of the storytelling that Janny Wurts is using as well, is not going to be for everyone. And I think that if this is your jam, like if you were reading Tolkien and thinking, could this be longer and more flowery, then absolutely this is going to be up your street. I mean, like, and when I say longer and more flowery, I wouldn't even, that's not me using those terms as a pejorative or as a negative, because I've read so many fantasy books and thought, this could have been longer. Like, I read, for example, Jade Legacy, right? Jade Legacy by Fonda Lee covers, like 20 or 30 years worth of time. And I was reading that going, why isn't each decade of this a separate trilogy? There's so much story in that book. I wished it had been longer. I finished it in like 2 days and thought to myself, I wish this had been a longer book. So wanting things to be longer is not a negative. And I mean, even in Jade Legacy's case, I didn't think that it was a bad book per se. I just wanted more of it. With Curse of the Mistwraith, there were several parts of the book that I was incredibly engaged. So normally I do my reviews as non-spoiler, right? But this book is 30 years old to this year, and how useful are spoiler-free reviews? What I'll do is I'll let you know specifically when I'm switching over to talking some specific spoilers. Even those I don't think would ruin your enjoyment of the book. But if you hadn't read it, I'll have like a little spoiler section at the end. Anyway, so I really enjoyed several sections of the book that were unfortunately nowhere near each other. So I enjoyed, I think the opening is really good. And then I think that there is a section around the coronation chapter, which is kind of halfway through, I think. Let me have a look. There's actually a thingamajig here. So, yeah, two-thirds of the way through, there's a chapter called Coronation Day, and the previous chapter, Itara. I really, really liked those chapters. Those were my favourite parts of the book. And then the final action sequences at the end were really, really fantastic. But for me, the stretches between I wasn't as invested in. It was hard for me to be invested in the two leads in Arathon and Lysaea. And I think that a lot of that is because the books kind of seems to be quite heavily weighted towards Arathon. The book is quite heavily weighted towards Arathon, in very much a kind of like, it almost seems like they're foreshadowing that Arathon will be the lead, the protagonist, the hero of the story, and Lysaea will be the villain. And the prologue very clearly foreshadows that. The book is called The War of Light and Shadow, and Arathon has shadow magic and Lysaea has light magic. So, I think it's not, even that I wouldn't say is particularly a spoiler. But we'll talk about the specific spoiler elements that I think kind of turned me off the book's plot later on. So basically the story is Arathon and Lysaea are princes, in a world called called Dashalur. Dashalur. They're from another planet, another world in the multiverse, for example. They are from this world, and they are half brothers. So their mother was married to a king, and when the king, who was not a very nice person, when he was abusive towards her, she ran away. She fell in love with the king of the pirates, and the king of the pirates and her had a son, and that son is Arathon, the second, the lead, I would say, in the book. Lycia is the king and the queen's son. What's the word? I can't think of the word. The non-bastard son, basically, of the queen. So they, Arathon has been sent to mage school by his mother, and has learned to use his shadow magic and learned other spells as well. Lycia has been kept at court and has learnt things like fencing and politics and manners and things like that. So he's kind of got all this kind of typical typical prince background, and then and Arathon has been raised by mages, and then from the mages he went to fight with his father for the pirate army. And the book starts with Arathon being captured and brought by Lycia to the court to face judgment by Lycia's father. So that's kind of how we start, and that part of the book is really engaging. So the aftermath of the big naval battle, the meeting of Arathon and Lycia, Arathon going to court and facing his judgment, all of this stuff is really good. This is all like the first chapter. And then something happens, and this is absolutely like, so I was reading this section of the book quite late at night. I was quite tired, and I genuinely think that I missed a huge plot point, or either I missed a huge plot point, or it just wasn't elaborated on too deeply in the book. But Arathon is exiled out of their world to another plane, and Lycia is sent with him. And I'm not 100% sure why that happened. I think that there's some sort of curse that links them, that mean that where one goes, the other must go. But again, if you know the actual what happened in there, please tell me in the comments, because either I completely missed it or it was kind of skirted over. I'm sure that there was something talking about how they were cursed and bound together, but I didn't know whether that was like, well, if Arathon goes, Lycia is dragged along behind him. They spend a lot of time in this second world, and it's kind of very inhospitable, and Lycia is completely unprepared for any sort of adversity, but Arathon is able to keep them both alive. So those chapters are really good. And then they get to Athera, which is the world where the story takes place, pretty much. And they meet two wizards, well, a wizard and his apprentice. And the wizard is basically like, right, the apprentice is a seer, and he can... sorry, just let the cat out. Go on then. Asandir is the name of the sorcerer, and his apprentice is like a seer, and the seer has seen that these two princes are the only people that can destroy the Mistwraith, which is a a big misty fog that covers the whole of Ethera, and their society has grown past the point where they need sunlight to live, basically, because the entire world is covered in this fog, and it's 24/7 as well. So it's really, really interesting the way that she does the world building for Ethera and for this kind of fog world. So it's as I was saying, the world building is really good. It has a lot of so in many fantasy books you will often get the first 30% of the book, especially in the first book in a series, the first 30% of the book, there will be lots of terminology, and world building elements that are not explained to you, which are then later woven into conversations and explained as part of the story. Some books will just out and out introduce a concept and then explain it to you in the narration. Dragons of Deepwood Fen, which I'm reading at the moment, actually does this. So there'll be a bit where it'll be like, and this part of a dragon, and they'll just explain in the narration. It's not a dialogue or a question that explains it. So I thought that was really interesting. Yes, so I thought that was really interesting. Sorry, I've just got a message on my watch. So yes, but what Janny Wurts does is there are quite a lot of concepts that I feel she leaves you to kind of infer. There are some things that she explains quite well, but then there's a whole side story with some evil snakes that I didn't particularly understand, and I think that is inserted to prove the power of the sorcerer characters, the wizards, and to show you how powerful they are. But I think it's also put in there to show you how dangerous the world is. But it doesn't seem to kind of link together. There's multiple antagonists in the book, but many of them are kind of vague natural antagonists, rather than a magical thunderstorm, for example, is kind of the high storms in the Stormlight Archive are kind of a magical but non-personal antagonist, and the antagonists in Curse of the Mistwraith are very much not people. They're not people. They're not. They have no personality. They have no kind of wants, needs, hopes, dreams, motivation. It seems, and I found that to be quite. I found that I had trouble connecting with the story because the villain was kind of so amorphous. At least, the Mistwraith itself is very amorphous. The political section of the book. So once you get to Atara and the chapter called Atara and the chapter called Coronation Day, then you start to see the political side of the book, and I really enjoyed that. I think that Wurts's political writing is really, really interesting, and she's it's quite interesting that she's kind of anti. She's very anti the merchants and the capitalists, as it were, of the society of Itara, and most of the capitalist characters are very, I would say, all but one are essentially one-note cackling villains, but that's okay for the type of story she's telling here, because the main characters have a little more personality than that. There's a few characters that I didn't particularly care for or understand why they were good, like Dakar, The Apprentice. He just seems to kind of screw everything up, and like he's the seer who is able to see all these visions that are helping to guide the wizard and on what they're looking to do, but he's also like an absolute liability, and I don't know why, if you had to hang out with him for centuries, you wouldn't be like, well, let's sort out your huge problems that are causing us massive issues. So that was annoying. The characters of Arathon and Lycia, they're interesting because they both have a conflict. Arathon's conflict is that he is destined to be a king, but that he doesn't want to be. He just wants to be a musician. And Lycia's conflict is, well, it doesn't really come up until later in the book. The biggest conflict I guess he has is that he wants to be king, but there is kind of no kingdom for him, and the kingdom of in Ithara, that is Ithera. The kingdom in Ithera that is kind of bequeathed to him is one that he's quite distasteful of. There's a lot of Lycia. I think Lycia gets a real short shrift in this book. And not that he doesn't get enough time on screen, although I don't think he does get enough time on page. But the other thing with Lycia is that I think that he's kind of more of a story. He almost feels more of a plot, like the plot happens to him rather than that he makes anything happen until the very end of the book. And then that kind of him making things happen is because of something else. And someone else pointed out that a lot of the problems of this book, or not the problems, a lot of the things that might turn off readers, and which I found weren't to my liking, weren't to my taste, were plot elements that would have been solved if everyone had just sat down and talked. And there are plenty of opportunities for everyone to sit down and talk in this book. We're talking about the chapter where they're crossing the desert and getting to Ithera. So everything up to the end of that section where they're crossing the desert is the first 100 pages, and then you get from page 103 to page 460, and most of that is sitting around talking. There is a major conflict that is discussed at the beginning of the book, and throughout the first kind of third, which is kind of just closed off without much fanfare in the middle of the book, which was quite unsatisfying, I would say. Do you know what? I think it's time for us to shift into the spoilers now. So we'll have a very short, very sharp spoiler section. But what I do want to say is that for many people, you will love this book. For me, I almost didn't like it. I would say that this is a dead on 3 out of 5 stars for me, because, or maybe even a 2. It's so hard to give this 2 stars, because 2 stars to me implies that it is badly written, which it is not. It is written well, but not to my taste. Yeah, I think that's why I'll give it a 3 star. So I'm going to give this 3 stars, and it's 3 stars because, like I said, it's very, very well written, but the writing style and the story that is told just wasn't really to my taste. So now we're going to shift into the spoiler section. If you want to go away and not read and not have this kind of very short 5-minute spoiler chat, then please subscribe to the channel, like the video, comment down below whether you're going to read this one or not, and spoiler viewers, let's go. So, spoiler zone begins. The Curse of the Mistwraith, the title of the book. The actual curse, so them defeating the Mistwraith at about not long past the halfway point, felt like when, so in Sanderson's lecture series, he talks about how if you tell people that the journey they're going on is one thing, and then you do another thing, that's unsatisfying. And that's kind of what Curse of the Mistwraith felt like to me. So we're told that they're going to fight the Mistwraith, but then fighting the Mistwraith kind of feels almost like, you know how in Dragon Ball Z, some of the fights, a lot of the fights are like 30 minutes of two people charging up without even like throwing a punch or whatever. The fight with the Mistwraith is kind of like a mental battle of willpower. Or at least that's kind of how it feels. And that just really didn't sit with me at all. I found those stretches of the book to be almost boring. Well, boring's a stretch. I found them tough to get through. And the whole thing as well is that they talk about how, you know, going to fight the Mistwraith would be so difficult and, you know, it could kill them. And then they spend like months hanging out with the Mistwraith, and much of those months is just completely skipped over. And it seemed like they're just kind of doing this war of attrition where like every day they like chop off a bit of the Mistwraith, and like they find out that the Mistwraith is sentient and is malevolent, but we don't find out why it wants to do what it's doing. We don't find out what the Mistwraith is. We know it comes from another world, another plane, but we don't really know anything else about it. Maybe Janny Wurts will come back to the Mistwraith in later books, but for now, it was very unsatisfying as a antagonist. Then the fact that they offer up Lycia essentially as like a, well, we'll put him front and centre before the Mistwraith, because if the Mistwraith kills him, you know, like he's got less magical power or something like that. So what happens is that Lycia and Arathon are cursed by the Mistwraith when they kill it, and they're cursed to want to try to kill each other. And so basically whenever they see each other, they go into like a blind rage to try and kill each other. But that doesn't actually happen for like another 200 pages. And the only kind of the negative effects appear to be like, oh, maybe they're a little like Lycia is a bit grumpy with him, but like it doesn't really seem to affect Arathon at all until the very end of the book, when suddenly it's completely irresistible for him to want to try and kill Lycia. The book feels, in many ways, the book does feel too long. So I said earlier before that a book being long is not pejorative for a fantasy book. I've read Of War and Ruin, which is 1,500 pages, and took me less than half of the time it took me to read this, which is 800 pages. I felt like Lycia is always on the back foot. Wurts seems to really dislike him, or the narrator of the book, which, you know, reading the prologue, which says that Lycia is the hero, is in historical texts referred to as the hero, and Arathon is the villain, but that wasn't actually the case. And then the book's narrator then goes on to, I would say, pretty broad strokes paint Lycia as becoming more and more and more corrupt throughout the book, if that would make sense. And then like, but the problem I would say also is that the enmity that he has with Arathon isn't natural. It's a part of this curse. And also, if Arathon and him or the sorcerers, the wizards or whatever, had sat down with Lycia and been like, hey, you're cursed, you're going to uncontrollably hate Arathon, let's separate you. Like, I don't know why they keep Lycia around in order to screw up the coronation. We get introduced to this character Alera very early on, and there's like a kind of a romantic bond that forms like instantly, so kind of insta-love almost, that trope between Arathon and Alera, but then Arathon and Alera never meet again throughout the book. And like, I know that we're dealing with an 11-book series here, but I feel like I wanted more from that relationship in just this book to entice me to want to read the other books. So I think that those are most of my spoiler complaints. Will I read the next book? Oh, should I unspoiler? Let's unspoiler. Will I read the next book? I honestly don't know. This one took me so long to read that it really ate into my reading plans for December, and I'm now like 7 days behind, which is really not ideal, seeing as this was a very big month for my reading. Luckily, I had 2 rereads planned for the Remember December event, which I can drop. But I don't know if I've got another month where I can read just one book by Janny Wurts and then a couple of other small things. So, Curse of the Mistwraith, for me, was a bit of a miss. I wonder if down the line I can get to a point as a person where I enjoy this kind of book more. I feel like this is kind of like the deep end of this style of novel. And as I'm not new to reading, but as a new habitual obsessive reader, so I only really got back into reading as a hobby more than like 1 or 2 books a year in like 2021. So I'm not even 2 years in yet to my reading obsession, and I have to say, I think maybe I tackled this one too early, and that maybe this would be one for me to read when I have less time pressures, when my kids are older, maybe when I have more experience with fantasy books. So I think I would possibly put this series on hold and come back to Ships of the Merior, which is the next book, sometime next year, maybe. But I don't know whether my voice and my I don't know whether my voice adds anything to the conversation around the Wars of Light and Shadow, if that makes sense. So I think that it's probably best for me to stick to books where I have something more positive and more useful to say, and also yeah, I don't know. There's lots. When I finished this book, I was relieved that I finished it, but I was curious as to where it went. And I don't think that Wurts is not a bad writer. She's fantastic. This book is so well written. The prose is so brilliant, but it's not my style. So will I carry on? I don't know. But let's get back together in a few months, and maybe I'll add it to a future TBR. Thanks so much for watching this marathon. Probably the longest. Yeah, this is almost 35 minutes. This is the longest review I've ever recorded. So thanks again for watching the whole video if you've got this far. If you have got this far, drop a pirate emoji because Arathon is a pirate. If you like this video, please do give it a like. If you disagree with me or you'd like to clarify any of the mistakes that I may have made by misreading the book, then please do comment down below and let me know anything that I got wrong. I am always open to constructive criticism, or where I may have misread something, or sleepily misread something. And please do subscribe to the channel. We have got, as I say, Dragons of Deepwood Fen review coming up later this week. And I'd love to talk to you about that then. And tomorrow will be my 2024 new releases that I'm excited for video. So thanks again for watching, and I'll speak to you tomorrow.